Joining us now, former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Miguel Diaz, also with us, Father Gustavo Morello, a Jesuit priest. He is professor and director of the undergrad studies at Boston College. Thank you both for being with me this morning. Father Morello, Pope Francis, the first Latin American pontiff, gave him certainly a different perspective from all of his predecessors. What are some of the things you think that inspired, influenced him because he was Argentinian?
I think so. One of the important things was his idea of working for the people, the closeness to the people. I think there is some tradition of Argentinian and Latin American politics of measuring the good of a government because it's closeness to the people. And I think to some extent Francis used that bar to measure his tenure at the Vatican. He was a pope that tried to get the people into the church and get the church closer to the people. And I think that was perhaps the most important mark of his tenure in the Vatican.
So difficult to separate the political from the pontificate in many ways, right, Father? Would you think that he was in some ways more political than maybe others in the past? And I'm thinking, because you cannot say that Saint Pope John Paul II was not political, and he had such a distinct mark on the world of politics. And so is Francis, you think, his legacy one more political or less political, or is it just capital P versus small p?
I would say it's capital P, like in the case of John Paul II, but different backgrounds. John Paul II came from the Cold War, and that life experience influenced his view. And popes are human beings. Francis' experience of Latin American reality influenced his view. I think he was trying to make politics and the church work for the people. I think that one of the problems that we have in the US was to try to understand him as progressive or conservative, and I think this is a different way of looking at that, more like people versus elites, perhaps. That would be a better approach to understand his doing. As much as communism, anti-communism work was clearer to understand John Paul II, this is not the case with the Argentinian Pope. His agenda has been portrayed as progressive many times, but I do think also that his performance was critical or a criticism to the progressive point of view. Like, can you imagine having the main figure of the Catholic Church, the guy who sits at the Holy See, being the more progressive figure in our political world? That's unthinkable, I think.
It certainly is something to think about. Ambassador, I know that you had a chance to meet with Pope Francis. What are you going to remember about him?
Well, I think the jovial personality, I will never forget a couple of years ago that I had a chance to pick up my guitar and to sing to him one of the famous Argentinian tangos, Adios muchachos, compañeros de mi vida. And he just bursted out in laughter. And so that kind of cordial, familial, heartfelt communication is something that I will always remember. But also to piggyback on what we have been discussing, two quotes from him, one of them more recently, and the other one was the very first things he uttered when he took this trip outside of Rome to the island of Lampedusa. And he said, we are a society which has forgotten how to weep, how to experience compassion, suffering with others. And then he used the term, the globalization of indifference has taken, from us the ability to weep. And I think this is a signature of his papacy, is compassion, is the care of the poor, the option for the marginalized, the peripheries. And then just recently when he sent a letter to U.S. bishops, very much pointing to what is going on in our country in terms of our lack of compassion for the most vulnerable. He talked about, he says, and I'll quote him, the true common good is promoted when a society and government with creativity and strict respect for the rights of all, as I have affirmed on numerous occasions, welcomes, protects, promotes, and integrates the most fragile, unprotected, and vulnerable among us. And then he concludes that, that paragraph, that section by saying what is built on the basis of force and not untruth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and ends badly. And so I think that, his care for the planet, his cares for the common good, his phrase, economies that kill, to emphasize people over profit. Who am I to judge when he issues this statement with respect to members of the LGBTQ plus community like myself? His meeting with trans people. I think all of that speaks to, really simply the preaching and the praxis of Jesus for those of us that call ourselves Christians, in terms of, putting that into practice, the heart over laws and really paying attention to concrete human lives and their stories.
Father Morello, I was just thinking about, and as you were so correct, I was saying, within the context of a Catholic Church that's, thousands of years of dogma, tradition, thought, and theology, nothing, I guess, could be considered permanent other than, I guess, the elemental truths of it. But Francis was not the same level of writer, I guess, of dogma as was Benedict or John Paul II. Do you see him leaving a legacy within the dogma of the Catholic Church?
I do think his legacy is the pastoral approach that he incarnate. The idea that more than ideas or dogmas, the main dogma is love your neighbor. And he emphasized that, as the ambassador has been saying. I think that will be the most important legacy that he left. It's not about fighting about ideas, but is doing good for the people. And I think that's an important teaching from Jesus. It's a dogma of the church, if you want. It's the bone of the church teaching, love your neighbor. And in that sense, he emphasized that very much.
Former Ambassador Miguel Diaz and Father Gustavo Morello, thank you both so very much. Really appreciate it.